This week we are moving right along to operant conditioning, which is something you all are probably more familiar with in your everyday life. It's important to first start off by separating and understanding the difference between classical and operant conditioning. Because in my experience, that's one of the hardest things for students to do, is to separate the two and not confuse parts of them together. As I'll touch on briefly at the end of this short lecture, often in the real world, we see classical conditioning and operant conditioning working in tandem. And so sometimes when we are generating real-life examples of scenarios that could illustrate one of these concepts, we might come up with an overly complex scenario that actually uses both. So here we're going to quickly parse apart the difference between classical conditioning and operant conditioning, and then we will review the 4 contingencies of operant conditioning in some examples that you read about in your text. Now, most of the notes and some additional explanation and content are available in module pages within the module that you can easily print out and use as you're going through the activities this week and as you study for test 2. So first, we just covered classical conditioning. So hopefully you can think of a few words to describe what classical conditioning is. Hopefully we came up with something like it's automatic and without thought. It's just simple association. It's reflexive. And so in classical conditioning, all we're really doing is looking at how antecedents, which is a fancy behaviorist word for the stuff that comes after before, how those antecedents affect behaviors. So how you react to something, essentially. These responses are just reactions, and usually it's either this response or reaction is either an emotion, so something makes you happy. It could be a physical state, so looking at ice cream makes your stomach grumble, or it could just be a reflex. So hitting yourself on the knee with a mallet makes your knee jerk up, or touching a hot stove makes your hand jerk away. Okay, these are all automatic, without thought. They're just reactions to stuff, and usually these reactions are just bodily states or emotions. So in one quick example of classical conditioning, you see this a lot in advertising. And so in advertising, what they like to do is they like to associate their product with something that's already pleasant. And so they take their product, which would be a neutral stimulus. So in this example here, the product is going to be Coke. And they associate it with something that already naturally makes people happy, which is Christmas. And Christmas was actually probably classically conditioned before that because it was associated with gifts. But anyways, so they just associate their product with a unconditioned stimulus that already makes people happy, and it gives you this unconditioned response, which later becomes a conditioned response, which is excitement, happiness, family. So with classical conditioning, you're not even thinking about it. You're just watching this commercial, and then all of a sudden you automatically associate their product Coke with being happy, right? And so we can see the reverse of this in classical conditioning in advertising as well with Comcast. So if you remember, about less than 10 years ago, Comcast was just Comcast. I'm not even sure it was owned by NBC then, but that's beyond the point. It was just called Comcast, and they had a terrible reputation for bad customer service. And so the name Comcast, which used to be neutral, right, was associated with bad customer service, which was an unconditioned stimulus, which naturally elicited unpleasant feelings from people and anger, right? And so since their name is associated with anger now, they switched their name to something different. And so their services now are under the name Xfinity. And so they tried to get rid of that bad classical conditioning that they had brought upon themselves with their bad customer service by changing their name and trying to get rid of that association. But when it comes down to it, classical conditioning is nothing more than automatic associations and automatic reactions just because some things are getting paired together, okay? It's very lower level learning, doesn't require any thought. On the other hand, operant conditioning is what we're going to be learning about this week, and it is a little bit more advanced learning. It's more thoughtful, and so it's going to be something that you do in everyday life. Almost every behavior that you engage in is involved in operant conditioning to some extent. So when we talk about operant conditioning, we think of learning that's more thoughtful. So if I do this, that will happen. We also call it instrumental learning or instrumental conditioning because you can use something or do something to get something else. But a key difference here is that you understand this. So we as humans, and even when we look at this in animals, understand that doing this leads to this. And so it's essentially a cause and effect thing where we want to focus on how consequences, so what comes after we do a behavior, affects the probability of doing that behavior in the future. And we're looking at more complex behaviors here versus these just reactions that we were getting in classical conditioning. We can look at actual more complex behaviors here. So here we're looking at the antecedent, so what comes before the behavior, what causes you to react that way. And then here we're looking at what comes after the behavior, the consequences. We can also look at the difference between classical conditioning and operant conditioning as one being involuntary and the other is voluntary. So classical conditioning is involuntary. You don't think about it, you don't do it on purpose, it just happens and it's built into our lower level survival learning. Operant conditioning, we know what's going on and it's voluntary. So because this happened, we choose to do this more often, or we choose not to do this anymore since that happened. And so one is involuntary. This one we're talking about this week is voluntary. And so this is the type of conditioning that you can really use to help shape and change behavior in your own life and in others' lives around you. And so what really matters here and what we'll look at next is that the behavior will change. Either your behavior will change or someone else's behavior will change depending on what the consequence was. So let's just look at some general examples of operant conditioning, and then we'll come back to them later and look at them in a little bit more detail. So one example might be that Jamie studied hard and got an A in her test, so she studied hard for the next test also. Obviously, studying hard worked, so she did it again and got another A. Or Leon got an ice cream party for his perfect attendance this year and had such a good time at the ice cream party that he did the same thing again next year. So because he did this, this happened. So when going 80 miles per hour on 285, Fiona got a $300 speeding ticket. So now she never speeds on that stretch before. So because of this, that happened. And so voluntarily, she is now changing her behavior. Or the last time I answered an unknown number, it was a spam call, which is always a true story. So I never answer unknown numbers anymore. And so this is all thoughtful learning and moderation of behavior, totally based on what the consequences are. So there are 4 types of operant conditioning, and we refer to them in the text and in general as contingencies. And so there's 2 major categories of contingencies. The first is we have to look at whether the behavior is increasing or decreasing. So are you more likely to do that behavior in the future? Does that behavior increase? Sometimes in the book, they refer to it as strength. So does that response get stronger? Typically stronger just means that it starts to occur more often. The second broad category that we look at is whether the consequence added, so applied something, or took something away. And so the 4 contingencies are positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment. So there's one major hurdle that it comes to when we're learning these 4 contingencies, and it is that the colloquial way that we use the terms positive and negative and reinforcement and punishment are not necessarily the same ways that we use them in operant conditioning and in behaviorism. So positive doesn't mean what you think it means here, and reinforcement or punishment doesn't necessarily mean what you think it means here. So what we have to do is we have to throw out your automatic reactions to these words out of the window. We want to say that positive means something good and negative means something bad, right? We want to say that reinforcement means something good and punishment means something bad. But those are oversimplified, and that might work in, you know, the everyday life as you're using these terms, but they mean something more specific here. And so you need to be really careful as you're going through and generating examples and helping identify examples as we work through operant conditioning, that you're going to have this gut reaction to think that positive means something good and negative means something bad. So first, when we're determining whether something is a punishment or a reinforcer, or something is punishing or reinforcing, we only determine that by the effect on the likelihood of future behavior. So this is important. You can only tell if something was a punishment or if something was a reinforcer by looking at the effect that it had on future behavior. So a punishment causes a decrease in the future, in the behavior in the future, okay? So that the behavior starts to occur less often or stops occurring. Whereas reinforcement causes an increase in the behavior in the future. So that behavior begins to happen more often, you get a stronger response. The key here is, let's go back a second, the key here is that it's about the actual effect it had on the behavior. It has nothing to do with your intention. So a lot of the times we will punish children in everyday life, right? But that's not really a punishment when it comes to operant conditioning unless the punishment worked. So sometimes we will, I used to say when I was a teenager, I would be grounded for sneaking out of the house. Grounding was intended to be a punishment to make me stop sneaking out of the house, when really all grounding did was make me sneak out of the house more because I was grounded all the time. So that wasn't actually a punishment. We could not define that grounding that my parents put in place as a punishment because it didn't actually decrease the targeted behavior, okay? The same thing is with reinforcement. Say you tried to give a reward to a child. That's not a reinforcement if it didn't actually cause an increase in the behavior. So if you gave your child a $10 bill for getting an A on their test, but they went and got a C on the next test, that would not be a reinforcement because the behavior didn't increase. So we have to really look at what the actual result was, the effect was on the behavior. When it comes to determining positive or negative, we determine those by whether the consequence applied a stimuli or removed a stimuli. It does not have anything to do with whether it was a good stimuli or a bad one or a pleasant one or an unpleasant one. Think of the mathematical symbols, a plus for adding or a negative for removing. That usually helps me here. So a positive reinforcement or punishment will add or apply a stimuli, whereas a negative reinforcement or punishment will remove a stimuli. So again, you're going to automatically want to associate positive with something good and negative with something bad. Sometimes that might be the case, but not necessarily. So you'll get tripped up on examples by assuming that positive means good or bad. So remember, just think of the mathematical signs instead. Positive is plus for adding something, and negative is a minus sign for removing something. So let's look at all these examples now, one by one. Starting with positive reinforcement. It is the addition, presentation, application, whatever you want to call it, of a stimulus after a behavior that causes an increase in that behavior in the future. So the positive here is the addition of something, of a stimulus, and the reinforcement here is that it causes an increase in that behavior in the future. Now, positive reinforcement is one that we are more familiar with in everyday life. So typically we can think of this as getting a reward. So it's synonymous with getting a reward for something. But again, assuming that reward worked. So assuming the reward increased the behavior in the future. So again, if you gave your kid a $10 bill for doing well on his test and then he didn't do well on the test that next time, that would not be positive reinforcement. So you're adding something which in turn increases the behavior in the future. Negative reinforcement, on the other hand, is the removal of a stimulus after a behavior that causes an increase in that behavior in the future. So this is undoubtedly one of the trickiest ones. It's a little less common, even though we experience it every day. So this one takes a minute to wrap your head around. So again, negative is the removal of a stimulus, where the negative sign, we're taking something away, and the reinforcement is the increase in that behavior in the future. So typically, this is synonymous with the increase of a behavior because it helps avoid something unpleasant. So common examples are taking a Tylenol successfully gets rid of a headache, and so you're more likely to take a Tylenol in the future. And so taking a Tylenol removes, that's the negative, removes your headache, and in turn, it causes you to take Tylenol more in the future, which is an increase in the Tylenol taking behavior. So we have negative reinforcement. So anything that you do to help remove a bad aversive stimulus, so putting on sunglasses. Putting on sunglasses takes away the terrible glare of the sun. So it's removing an aversive stimulus, and then in turn, you are more likely to wear sunglasses in the future when it's sunny outside. So it increases the behavior. So we're taking away something bad, and then we keep doing that. Positive punishment, the next one. So positive, again, is going to be the addition or the presentation of a stimulus after a behavior that causes a decrease in the behavior. Again, the punishment is being the decrease in the behavior in the future. So typically, this one is synonymous with receiving something unpleasant as a punishment. And again, assuming that behavior actually decreases in the future. So just because you got something unpleasant for doing something, it's not going to be a positive punishment unless that behavior that you got it for actually decreases in the future. So spanking is a good example of this both being punishment and not punishment. Spanking, if it works, which it does sometimes in the short run, that's the addition of a spanking or pain, and that should lessen the behavior. So you're adding something, but sometimes spanking doesn't always lessen that behavior, and it can elicit other behaviors as well, like avoidance behaviors that we'll talk about more in the future. So really, again, it all comes down to what effect it had on that behavior in the future. The last one here is negative punishment. So that's the removal of a stimulus, usually a good stimulus, after a behavior that causes a decrease in that behavior in the future. So again, this is typically synonymous with having something pleasant that you like taken away as a punishment. And again, as always, assuming that behavior actually decreases in the future. It's not about your intention, it's what the actual results on the behavior was, when it comes to operant conditioning at least. So this chart, when you're going through examples, something similar is found in your book, and you can also print this out on the module page. This is really helpful when it comes to breaking down examples and determining what they are. And so we have, if you have a decrease in behavior, and then you can look up whether it's adding or removing the stimuli. So let's work through some examples and apply these 4 contingencies. So let's go back to the first example I mentioned when we began this ed puzzle. Jamie studied hard and got an A on her test, so she studied hard for the next test also. So let's identify some of the main components here. So first we have the behavior that Jamie studied hard. So remember, all of these contingencies, it's a consequence that happens after a behavior. So we have to start with the behavior, Jamie studied hard, and then what was the consequence or the stimulus that came afterwards? Well, she got an A on her test. And so then third, we have to identify the resulting effect on the behavior in the future. So she studied hard for the next test also. So we have the behavior, the consequence or stimulus, and then the effect on the behavior in the future. Now, to determine what type of contingency is, we have to go a bit further. So did this consequence add something or take something away? Is it positive or negative? Well, this one added a good grade. She received an A, and so that would be positive, right? And then we have to determine whether this resulting behavior increased or decreased. And so since she studied hard for the next test also, seems that behavior increased or persisted. And so an increase in behavior would be reinforcement. And so for this example, we end up with adding something and increasing the behavior, which is positive reinforcement. Let's go back to Fiona and speeding on 285. She was going 80 miles an hour on 285 and she got a $300 speeding ticket. So now she never speeds on that stretch. This may or may not be a true story for me. So let's identify the three main components. We have the behavior. She was speeding on 285. The consequence or stimuli was that she got a $300 speeding ticket. And the change in future behavior was that now she never speeds on that stretch, so that behavior decreased, right? So is this consequence adding a stimuli or taking it away? It added something. It added a $300 speeding ticket. She got a $300 speeding ticket. Now, for the resulting change in the behavior, did that behavior increase or decrease? Well, the behavior decreased since she is speeding less often on this stretch or not at all. And so we're adding something that decreased the behavior, and so that would be not positive reinforcement. That would be positive punishment. So this is an example of positive punishment here. Next one, Joy was late for curfew and had her phone taken away as a result. So she made sure to show up on time from then on. Okay, so let's say Joy's got a 10 p.m. curfew on school nights or whatnot. She got home late and her mom took her phone away for the week as a punishment. So we have the behavior that she was late, the stimuli or consequence is that she got her phone taken away, and then the resulting change in behavior was that she made sure to show up on time from then on. And so was the stimuli and was the consequence adding a stimuli or taking something away? Well, she had her phone taken away literally, and so that was removing something. And did the change in behavior, did it increase or decrease? So here I have that so this being late decreased. So this might be a little confusing since she showed up on time from then on. So her behavior of showing up on time increased. But here are the main behavior that we're talking about was showing up late. And so her behavior of showing up late decreased. And so we removed something that decreased the behavior. So that would be negative punishment. Another common example is being grounded. And so assuming that the being grounded works, as if in my example, being grounded was not an actual punishment because it did not work operationally. You are taking away when they're grounding someone. So you could be like adding restriction, right? But really, what is being grounded? Being grounded is taking away the ability to leave or taking away freedom. And so you're taking away something good that they like in order to decrease the behavior. And so that would be negative punishment if the behavior actually decreased in the future. So one more example is I started wearing my glasses when I worked at the computer, and I stopped getting tension headaches, which I used to always get when working online all day. So now I always wear my glasses when I'm working, and I'm wearing them right now. So let's identify the major components of this example. So we have the behavior. The behavior is me wearing my glasses. The consequence was that I stopped getting tension headaches. and the resulting change in behavior is that now I always wear them when I'm working. And so did the consequence add or take away a stimuli? It removed the tension headaches, and so it took away something unpleasant. And then did it increase or decrease the behavior in the future? It increased that behavior. So I removed something that in turn increased the behavior in the future. So that would be negative reinforcement. And so this was the same example as wearing your sunglasses or taking a Tylenol. And so let's look at a not so good example, since you guys are going to be coming up with examples on your own this week. So Clark cussed in front of his mom, and she washed his mouth out with soap. So a lot of us would come up with this example and say, Clark cussed in front of his mom, she washed his mouth out with soap. So she added this terrible punishment, right? So maybe it's positive punishment. Well, we don't really know, because we don't know what happened to Clark afterwards. Did Clark stop cussing? Did he cuss less? Did he cuss less often? Or did he keep cussing the same amount and maybe just stopped cussing in front of his mom? So because it doesn't mention, and we don't mention the result, the effect that the consequence had on the behavior afterwards and on the future, we don't know whether it was actually a punishment or a reinforcement. We have to see the change in the behavior. So when you come up with examples, you got to have those three parts that we just had with all the previous examples: the behavior, the consequence, and then what happened to the behavior in the future? Did it go up or down? So that's going to be about it for this Ed puzzle. I wanted to point out one thing and mention it again as we're coming up with some examples. And as you're getting back also grades on your test 1 and feedback on your short essays, where you had to come up with examples of classical conditioning. As I mentioned, for classical conditioning and operant conditioning, oftentimes in real life, these things are working in tandem. And so when we come up with a complex example and something that's not really cut and dry, we might actually have something that involves both. So a lot of times when people give examples of classical conditioning, it's actually operant conditioning, really. And so we can see the difference here. Remember, classical conditioning is looking at the antecedents, and operant conditioning is looking at the consequences. And so these antecedents are simply things that are getting paired together, automatically associated, and it's causing this reactive behavior, right? Whereas then, for operant conditioning, the likelihood of that behavior may increase or decrease in the future, depending on what the consequence was afterwards. So let's say we'll go back to the old dog doorbell example that we've been working with from the beginning. So the dog associates the doorbell with someone entering the house, right? So after classical conditioning, the doorbell now makes the dog bark. Well, that drives me crazy. And so I actually have a bark collar for the dog. And the bark collar will vibrate and make a loud, terrible noise to the dog after he barks. And so whereas the dog is just automatically barking in response to the doorbell, afterwards, the dog is getting this collar vibration and beep, and it's causing him to bark less in the future. And so he's not barking as much now because he's wearing this collar. So the behavior has decreased, but initially this behavior was just a reaction to the doorbell. So we can see how these two things can work in tandem and concern the same behavior, but how they're still very different concepts. So if you have any questions this week or need any more clarification or confusion, make sure to print out the notes that are available in the module. Again, they have further examples and further explanation. And then ask any remaining questions that you have in the discussion board this week. You can always use those as an opportunity to ask questions, even if it doesn't specifically prompt you to do that.